I have recently wrote an article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled 2009 U.S. Policy Paper Planned Current Israeli-Iranian Tensions. And I wrote it right before Iran responded with multiple waves of drones and missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. So I'm going to read this, and then I'm also going to add in additional context considering Iran has now retaliated against the April 1st, 2024 Israeli strike on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. So let's read this article that I wrote. I'll take a look at the sources that I cite, and I will add in additional information as we go along. So let's begin. Since October 7th, 2023, it would appear a spontaneous chain of events is leading the Middle East deeper and deeper into conflict. From Israel's ongoing military operations in Gaza to its strikes on Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and repeated strikes across Syria, including the recent strike on Iran's embassy in Damascus, to the ongoing US-led confrontation with Yemen in the Red Sea, it would appear that poor diplomacy is failing to prevent escalation and is instead leading to mounting tensions and a growing potential for wider war. Now we can see just how much wider that potential war has become. In reality, almost verbatim, US-Israeli diplomacy, or lack thereof, and military operations are following a carefully laid out policy described in the pages of the Brookings Institution's 2009 paper, Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran. And the link to this will be in the video description below. Here is the cover. And what people have to understand is this is not the plan. These authors did not come up with this plan. They're simply writing a paper that reflects the consensus throughout Washington. These policymakers talk with the corporate financier interests that fund them. They talk to other policymakers in other think tanks. They talk to people in Washington, in Congress, at the Pentagon. This is the general consensus regarding US policy toward Iran. They are simply writing it down to make it easier to create consensus across all of the various stakeholders, which does not include the American people, by the way. As a matter of fact, much of the paper involves how to dupe the American people and the global public into going along with otherwise unjustified US foreign policy objectives. If you read this, it is essentially the playbook for US policy toward Iran. The Brookings Institution is a Washington-based think tank funded by both the US government and military, as well as the largest corporate financier interests across the collective West. And again, and this will be in the video description below, here's a 2020 disclosure of some of the largest contributors toward the Brookings Institution. You can see it's a combination of other corporate funded foundations, large corporations. Facebook is there, Google is there, Northrop Grumman, an arms manufacturer. If you search through here, you'll find Lockheed and other arms manufacturers, big oil, big finance. Everything is listed in there. You could go through the whole list yourself. And many of these corporate financier interests are also funding all of the other think tanks in Washington doing the same type of work. Its board of directors and experts are among the most prominent figures in US foreign policy and political circles. What is produced in the institution's papers is far from speculation or commentary, but instead reflects a consensus regarding the direction of US foreign policy, as I said. Its 2009 paper is no exception. For those who read its 170 pages in 2009, they would have learned about ongoing or future plans to overthrow or contain the Iranian government. There are entire chapters regarding diplomatic options, which laid out plans to appear to engage with Iran in a deal regarding its nuclear program, then unilaterally abandoning the plan and using its failure as a pretext to apply further pressure on the Iranian government and economy. That's under Chapter 2, Tempting Tehran, the engagement option. And it lays out very clearly that the US had no intention of upholding the deal, that it would be sabotaged, that Iran would be blamed for it, and that would be used as a pretext against Iran. Spelled out in black and white. There are chapters that detail methods of creating unrest within Iran, both by using US government-funded opposition groups, under Chapter 6, the Velvet Revolution supporting a popular uprising, and even through supporting US State Department-listed foreign terrorist organizations like the Mujahideen al-Khaliq, MEK. That's under Chapter 7, inspiring an insurgency, supporting Iranian minority and opposition groups. Other chapters detail a direct US invasion, Chapter 3, going all the way, invasion, and a smaller scale air campaign. That's under Chapter 4, the Osirak option airstrikes. Finally, a whole chapter is dedicated to using Israel to trigger a war the US would then appear reluctant to wade into afterwards. That's Chapter 5, Leave It to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. Just keep all of this in mind as we continue here. Since 2009, each and every one of these options has either been tried, in some cases multiple times, or is in the process of being implemented. The so-called Iran nuclear deal, signed under the administration of US President Barack Obama, unilaterally abandoned under the administration of US President Donald Trump, and efforts to revive it blocked under the administration of US President Joe Biden, is an illustration of not just how faithful US foreign policy unfolded in regards to the paper's contents, but the continuity of this policy regardless of who sat in the White House or who controlled the US Congress. Continuity of agenda. Today, one of the most dangerous options explored appears to be fully in motion, with the US and Israel deliberately creating a permissive environment across the Middle East for war and repeatedly provoking Iran to trigger it. And when I talk about creating a permissive environment for war across the region, I'm talking about the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attacks and the Israeli response to it, which was essentially flattening Gaza. And many people say that Israel has failed. They cannot defeat Hamas. Israel put Hamas into power. They don't want to defeat Hamas. They want Hamas there as a perpetual pretext to brutalize the Palestinian people until there are no more Palestinian people. Then maybe they will pull the plug on and erase Hamas. So let's talk about this chapter, Leave It to Bibi. The Brookings Institution makes several points clear. First, Iran is not interested in war with either the United States or Israel. It says that very clearly multiple times all throughout the paper. Second, the US must take great effort to convince the world that Iran, not Washington, provoked a US desired war. So the US desperately wants this war, but they desperately want to convince the world that it was Iran who provoked it. And third, even if repeatedly provoked, there is a high likelihood Iran would not retaliate and therefore deny the US and or Israel a pretext for wider war. And this is what the report actually says. It says it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. They're saying they might just launch them anyway, but it would be better if they could cite some sort of provocation before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to go to Iran in such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. And you could see, following the Israeli strike on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, the Western media is pretending like it never happened. As Iran retaliated, they write in their headlines, Iranian attack on Israel. Not Iranian retaliation. They just act as if Iran woke up one day and attacked Israel. So even if they can't achieve this through a series of events, they can manipulate what actually happened through the media and pretend that somehow it was unprovoked, nonetheless. The paper continues. It also says one method that would have some possibility of success would be to ratchet up covert regime change efforts in the hope that Tehran would retaliate overtly or even semi-overtly, which could then be portrayed as an unprovoked act of aggression, Iranian aggression. So you can see how the US is admitting that it's not just planning to do these things, it's already doing it. And then it would escalate certain efforts already underway to further provoke Iran. And then when Iran reacts, they will spin it as if it was an unprovoked Iranian provocation, an act of unprovoked Iranian aggression. The paper is admitting the US seeks war with Iran, but wants to convince the world it is Iran itself provoking it. The paper lays out the framework for a disingenuous diplomatic tract Washington could take with Tehran to enhance the illusion that Iran will be to blame for any war between it and the US, or of course Israel. And again, this is all about the US pretending that it seeks diplomacy. It was Iran desperate for war. And this is what the paper says. In a similar vein, any military operation against Iran will likely be very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. The best way to minimize international opprobrium and maximize support, however grudgingly or covert, which is important to keep in mind, because a lot of countries will openly say they oppose supporting the US in any way in an attack on Iran, but then they will covertly support the US anyway. Keep that in mind. Is to strike only when there is a widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer, one so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down. Under those circumstances, the United States or Israel, says or Israel in parentheses, could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger, and at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it upon themselves by refusing a very good deal. That was the Iran nuclear deal proposed under the Obama administration, unilaterally abandoned by the Trump administration, and then completely buried by the Biden administration. That was the entire plan. That was not President Trump deciding that on his own. It was decided before President Obama even proposed the deal in the first place. Israel plays a key role in this strategy. While Washington seeks to appear to be distancing itself from Israeli brutality amid its operations in Gaza, as well as its recent strike on Iran's embassy in Damascus, such provocations are central to Washington's own desire to pull Iran into a war it admits Tehran does not want to fight. The 2009 paper anticipates that Israeli strikes on Iran could, and again, this is a quote from the paper, trigger a wider conflict between Israel and Iran that could draw the United States and other countries, including the United States. Because that's ultimately what the US wants. It wants a war with Iran, does not want to be seen as provoking one. It wants to provoke Iran first, or allow Israel to start some sort of conflict with Iran, and then it could wade in and appear to be the victim of circumstances rather than the engineer of them. In reality, Israel's brutality amid its Gaza operations and its most recent strike on Iran's embassy are enabled entirely by US political, diplomatic, and military aid. The US not only gives Israel the military means to carry out this violence, it uses its position within the United Nations to lend impunity to Israel as it does so. As illustrated in the Washington Post April 4, 2024 article, US approved more bombs to Israel on day of World Central Kitchen strike. So this was Israel mass murdering aid workers in Gaza on the very same day they were doing that, and America was wagging its finger at Israel. They approved of additional arms to be shipped to Israel so that it could continue this brutality, this very predictable and even announced brutality, senseless, mindless brutality. So here's the Washington Post article. U.S. approved more bombs to Israel on day of World Central Kitchen strikes. The Biden administration signed off on thousands more bombs to Israel despite global condemnation for the IDF's killing of 7 World Central Kitchen employees. And I'm talking about predictable violence because before Israel even began its incursion into Gaza, the Israeli military openly said, we're focused on maximum damage. Ground offensive into Gaza seems imminent. I've quoted the IDF spokesman several times admitting this. So here, IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari made the startling admission that thousands of tons of munitions had already been dropped on the tiny strip, adding that while balancing accuracy with the scope of damage, right now we're focused on what causes maximum damage. And so anyone who hears that, Israel is planning to maximize damage in a densely populated urban environment, that means mass civilian casualties. That means ignoring the rules of war, punitively destroying a populated area. And when you decide that as a matter of policy, that means huge numbers, disproportionate numbers of civilians are going to die. So will aid workers, journalists, and everyone else caught in the middle. And they knew that, and the United States knew that, and they continued supporting Israel anyway. Many analysts appear surprised by Washington's paradoxical behavior, willing to believe the current Biden administration is simply incompetent and unable to rein in its Israeli allies. However, considering the central role such egregious provocations play in advancing stated U.S. foreign policy objectives against Iran, this should come as no surprise at all. It is the exact same situation when the United States murdered Iranian General Qasem Soleimani outside the airport in Baghdad. That was during the Trump administration. That was another attempt to draw Iran into a war it did not want to fight. All that is required now is an Iranian retaliation or an incident the US and Israel can convince the world was an Iranian retaliation. Well, now we see Iran did retaliate. They have said so themselves. And now we have to wait and see what happens next. Washington's greatest fear is that Iran won't retaliate. Let me explain this part anyway, even though Iran did retaliate, just so you can understand the mindset here. Iran has suffered US and Israeli provocations for decades. Perhaps the most egregious provocation in recent years prior to the Israeli strike on Iran's embassy in Damascus was the US assassination of senior Iranian military officer Qasem Soleimani in Iraq in 2020. While Iran did retaliate, it did so in a very measured manner. And I guess you could say this most recent retaliation was also measured. The attack on Iran's embassy on April 1st, 2024 was designed specifically to surpass the scale of the 2020 assassination, hoping to place irresistible pressure on Tehran to finally overreact, specifically because of the strategic patience Iran has exhibited in the past. It may also be to convince the world that irresistible pressure has been placed on Iran to make a staged attack blamed on Iran seem more believable. The 2009 Brookings paper, Which Path to Persia, clearly stated the problem. It would not be inevitable that Iran would lash out violently in response to an American air campaign and just interchange Israel with America, because it is planned that either Israel or America or both carry out some sort of big air campaign. But no American president should blithely assume that it would not. Iran has not always retaliated for American attacks against it. It is possible that Iran would simply choose to play the victim if attacked by the United States or Israel, assuming, probably correctly, that this would win the clerical regime considerable sympathy both domestically and internationally. However, since October 7th and the Israeli response, I have warned that that was designed entirely to stir up the people of the Middle East, across the Arab world, and also in Iran, and place incredible pressure on the respective governments to react or overreact in some way. Washington has attempted to convince the world it fears escalation between Israel and Iran. Newsweek in its April 4th article, White House very concerned about prospect of Israel-Iran war, would even quote the White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby as saying, "Nobody wants to see this conflict escalate." That is this article right here. And as we can see, that is entirely untrue. The US has designed a policy and worked on it for many years specifically to continue escalating in the Middle East. Despite Washington's words, its actions demonstrate an eager desire toward escalation. The 2009 Brookings paper admits that even a semi-overt retaliation by Iran could be used as a pretext, which should prompt fears that the US and Israel may cite any attack, regardless of the party responsible, and assign blame to Iran to justify further escalation, which is something Israel and the US could still do, despite the Iranian retaliation. In many ways, both the US and Israel have already attempted to do this in regards to the October 7, 2023 Hamas attacks, despite admitting there is no evidence of Iran's involvement. So do you remember how, even while admitting there is no evidence at all that Iran was involved in the October 7th attacks, the US, Israel, Europe, they were all still trying to connect it to Iran anyway, and they were trying to justify aggression against Iran and a response against Iran, despite admitting there's no evidence at all it was involved. I also want to show you this more recent article following the Iranian retaliation. This is from CNN. As Iran attacks Israel, Biden confronts an escalating Middle East crisis he had hoped to avoid. So he hopes to avoid this Middle East crisis. When the attack on the Iranian embassy took place, the US blocked any condemnation of Israel in the UN Security Council. Does that sound like a country attempting to prevent escalation, or a country opening the door as wide as possible for escalation? When Israel is flattening Gaza, massacring aid workers, and the US provides them thousands more bombs to continue the violence, is that trying to prevent escalation or fully fueling the fire to escalate as much as possible? Strategic patience has paid off well for Iran. By avoiding outright war with either the US or Israel, it and its allies have been able to slowly but surely reshape the region. Iran has done this by circumventing US sanctions. It is also closing the artificial rifts the US has cultivated since the end of World War II to divide and rule the Middle East. This includes repairing its own relations with Saudi Arabia and repairing ties between its ally Syria and Washington's Persian Gulf allies. As the region reshapes itself, the US is finding its primacy over it waning. Washington's list of willing proxies is growing shorter. Washington's proxies who remain are finding themselves increasingly isolated, especially Israel. And as each year passes, Washington's military power in the region becomes increasingly tenuous. Iran, if it continues along the successful path it has taken, will inevitably prevail over US interference along and within its borders. The only prospect the US has of reasserting itself over the region and advancing its regime change policy toward Iran is by provoking a large-scale war in which the US and or Israel can use direct military force to accomplish what decades of sanctions and subversion have failed to do. Eventually, the window of opportunity to do even this will close for both the US and Israel as Iran and the rest of the multipolar world continue to grow and the US and its proxies continue to find themselves increasingly isolated. As the US has revealed in Europe regarding its proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, this quickly closing window of opportunity has triggered dangerous desperation in Washington. Only time will tell how far this desperation compels US foreign policy in the Middle East and the actions of its proxies, especially Israel. Washington's other proxy, Ukraine, has resorted to desperate measures ranging from extraterritorial terrorism to strikes on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in a dangerous bid to change its flagging fortunes. Israel actually possesses nuclear weapons, making Washington's desperation in the Middle East all that much more dangerous. Now we've seen Iran retaliate. It was measured. Israel is claiming that it shot almost all of Iran's drones and missiles out of the sky, which I don't think is entirely true. But how are they going to justify any sort of large-scale attack on Iran if they claim that Iran's attack fell flat? Especially considering Iran launched this retaliation solely because Israel attacked its embassy in Damascus, Syria. So you can see the dangerous game that is being played. In this article, I talked about America and Israel's flagging military power in the region relative to the rest of the region and to the rest of the world. And we can see the same thing happening as this conflict unfolds in Ukraine. The US and its allies assumed Russia was backwards, that it would be unable to sustain military operations on the scale. It turns out Russia is more than capable of doing so. It's the West that is incapable of keeping up. Iran walked into this trap. It remains to be seen whether they did so knowingly, without having miscalculated, fully prepared to spring the trap and have it backfire in the faces of those who said it, just as Russia did in Ukraine. Remember, there was that 2019 Rand Corporation paper. This paper here, Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground, April 2019. They had a chapter titled Providing Lethal Aid to Ukraine, and the whole point of that option was to draw Russia into a large-scale protracted conflict inside Ukraine that they hoped would bleed Russia dry. But even that paper back in 2019 warned that it might not work out that well. It may even backfire in the face of the collective West, and we've seen how that has now happened. Only time will tell, so we'll have to keep a very close eye on this. By the time I release this video, maybe Israel will already have retaliated against Iran for retaliating against Israel's unprovoked unilateral strike on its embassy in Damascus, Syria. And if that does happen, I will put a pinned comment at the top of the comment section below the video discussing any recent development that might affect the content of this video. I will continue keeping an eye on this and covering this, as well as Ukraine, as well as the growing tensions in Asia Pacific between the US and China. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for the other places you can find and follow my work. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who is helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no money to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.